This is a series of conversations on great individuation, the full capacity for human psychological and spiritual development. Murray Stein is a celebrated Jungian psychoanalyst living in Switzerland, and Jim Manganiello is a pioneering depth psychologist and a long-time Dzogchen practitioner living in Boston. Individuation means the intensification and extension of experience in the individual person. Great individuation includes experience of the depths of personal life and the far reaches of archetypal images and beyond. Murray Stein speaks of the journey to the self and what this means for the consciousness of the individual.
Hi, Murray. I thought it would be a good idea for you to talk today. You're considered by many of us to be among the foremost authorities, and by some, the foremost authority on individuation. I know you've written a great deal about it, and the whole idea of addressing the issue of individuation in one's life feels critical. And you and I have made a distinction between in time and beyond time. I think your work is set up mostly for an in-time exploration, but as we're trying to collaborate on building a bridge to the timeless, it might be useful if you could make reference to that as well. So if you would, please, try to characterize what individuation is and shed light on the process itself as a progressive experience in time.
Okay, Jim, thanks for the challenging introduction question. Let me start out by just saying a very simple sentence and then expanding on it. Individuation is an intensification of experience as an individual. Individuation is an intensification of experience as an individual. And the way I see what we're doing is continuing and extending the work of Jung. Jung came up with this term individuation. He said a lot about it. He has a lot of ways of opening up the path to the individuation journey and experience. But basically, it boils down to an intensification of the experience as an individual, the experience of oneself, inner world and outer world, through the course of a lifetime. And there is a growth of consciousness aspect to that type of experience of oneself. So it's this growth of consciousness that we really focus on a lot in our work as Jungian analysts. Jung's last published work in his lifetime is a very interesting book, I think quite well known, often referenced, and written for a general public. And it has a lot to do with social issues and political issues and what he calls mass-mindedness. And the title of the work in English was translated from the German. German didn't have this title, but when they put it into English, they came up with this very interesting title, The Undiscovered Self. And what I see us trying to do is pursue that discovery further, to discover the self, okay? And so that's the way I would like to talk about our project, the discovery of the self and the becoming conscious of the self and living the self more than one does if one is unconscious and the self is undiscovered. Social scientists write about the economic man, or the political man. And these are ways of thinking about the human being and the problems that human beings encounter and their ambitions and their desires and so on. The economic person is interested in money. The political person is interested in power. We could say there is the spiritual person who is interested in the spiritual life and religion. There's the aesthetic person who's interested in beauty and art. And then there's the psychological. That's us. We're psychologists. We think, and I believe, and so do you, Jim, I know, that psychology underlies all of these different ways of thinking about the human being. It's all psychological in one sense or another. Money is psychological. Anything that touches on emotion, and what doesn't. Certainly money does, power does, religion does, beauty. It all touches on the emotional aspects of our existence. And when we get into the topic of emotion, we very rapidly come into what drives those emotions, what shapes those emotions, what governs those emotions, what are those emotions triggered by. And so we get into depth psychology. What's behind the emotions? What's underneath the emotions? Why do people want to become endlessly rich? Why do people want all the power in the world? What drives that? And in your recent podcast, you put your finger on, I think, what is an essential insight, and that is the human being tends toward egocentricity. That by that, we mean that the individual's immediate self-interest becomes the central preoccupation, whether you're dealing with money, power, beauty, religion. The desire to, and the tendency automatically to go to this kind of fallback position in the human species is to have everything associated with this central factor, the ego. When depth psychologists talk about the ego, they're talking about the I at the center of consciousness. And whatever's in consciousness is related to that I. That I is the center. So consciousness is by nature egocentric. That's how we function. We associate everything, our memories, our wishes, our perspectives, our desires, all, whatever's conscious to us is attached to that I, and that I is the center of the storm. And it is a storm around that I, often. And that can be seen on an individual basis, it can be seen on a national basis, international basis. Everybody's out for their own interests. Okay, that's power politics. And on an international level, every nation has a right to defend itself, wants to expand its borders, wants the best thing for its people, doesn't care about the others. It is a egocentric type of operation that we're dealing with in the psychological world. Now, depth psychology tries to go further, okay? The undiscovered self. When Jung writes about what's going on in the world in the late 1950s, he published that book, The Undiscovered Self. And he looked around at the world and he saw what? The threat of nuclear war was the big topic in those days, and the fear that it would be unleashed by some insane power monger in either in the Soviet Union or a strike by one of the Western countries to forestall the strike by the Soviet Union. Anyway, it was a very tense time. And he also looked back and he saw what had happened in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. And he said that as a psychiatrist, he believed that a certain percentage of the population, of any human population, had what he called a latent psychosis. That is, a potential for becoming irrational and driven by irrational forces that they don't even know what's taken over their consciousness. That's a psychosis. You become possessed by something, some force in the psyche, a complex or an archetype, as we say, and you don't know it until somebody calls your attention to it, maybe it calls you on it, and then you can reflect and become conscious of it. But he says that in a mass of people, a certain percentage have a latent psychosis that will respond and be triggered by a strong leader who offers something that this irrational part of us wants to know or wants to believe or wants to have. And that is the magic of the charismatic leader. They know how to manipulate the psychotic process in enough people in a population to gain great strength and great power. And those people who follow them are impenetrable. You cannot reason with them because they're possessed. So you have the problem of consciousness. They are not conscious of what they're doing. Jesus on the cross said, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." The soldiers were just following orders. And they were being good soldiers as they nailed him to the cross and opened his side with a spear and so on. Most people don't know what they're doing. In the economic realm, in the political realm, in the religious realm, they're just following some leaders, some doctrines, some dogmas. Now, what we're trying to do is become conscious of that. We're trying to open consciousness, open the ego even to what's driving it. As you've said in your many times to me, Jim, ask the question, who is thinking those thoughts? Who is feeling those feelings? Look at that. And then gradually you step back and you start seeing the stream of thoughts, and individuation is the experience of expanding consciousness and intensifying consciousness as an individual. You aren't going to get this opening by reading a book or by listening to a podcast. You're going to get this opening by inspecting yourself, by looking at yourself and experiencing those parts of yourself that are not available to ego consciousness under normal conditions. Now, in the individuation process, as we think about it in Jungian psychology, at least, the development of the ego and ego consciousness is absolutely necessary. When a child is born, it's natural that they come into the world, we say, with a potential self, that is, lots of potentials that maybe they will realize in their lifetimes, maybe they won't. But they come certainly in with a capacity and an ability to become an ego, to become an I. And this develops very early in childhood. You see it in the terrible twos, I want, they fight and struggle with their mothers in the grocery stores and throw themselves on the floor when they don't get the chocolate they want and so on. That's an ego. And that's necessary and it's important. And we don't try to break it. We don't try to destroy it. We try to work with it. And gradually the child outgrows the worst part of that kind of egotism, that total self-centeredness on the I, and is able to take into consciousness a bit the needs of others. You know, the mother is limited in her capacities. I have to wait a while. I have to wait to go to the bathroom for a little while. I have to wait to eat for a little while. Now it's time to take a nap. I have to do that. And so this is taken on board by ego consciousness as the ego also begins to integrate the expectations of the surrounding world, begins to adjust to the surrounding world, and gradually develops what we call a persona. That is a way of facing the world that is adapted, that bodes well for the success of the individual. They can get along with other people. They don't insist on their ways too much. But hidden within that and behind that persona is this egocentrism. The persona is a false self. It can pretend to be loving and kind and smiling and happy, but actually it's manipulating. It's manipulating the world by using the persona. Persona is a mask, and Jung saw through that mask in his own life and in his patients and so on. That mask is very useful in society and for getting a good job and getting along with people, but it's not the true self. The true self is something else. And there are different ways of speaking about the true self. Some people think about it as the real ego behind the mask, using the mask. That's not the way in which we're using this word self, or Jung used the word self. But it's important to know and become conscious of what's behind the persona and not get identified with it totally. And that's a step in individuation, to become conscious of how one is using a persona to manipulate the surrounding social context. And there are people who are masters at this, at the use of persona to manipulate other people, including the great, Führer, the leaders. They very quickly pick up on how to manipulate the masses, give them what they want, tell them what they want to hear, trigger their psychotic cores, and get them into a state of possession, and they'll follow you and do what you want. It's all done through the mask. And a very smart political leader will know that and won't be fooled by his own or her own mask and persona. If they're fooled by their own mask and persona and identify with it, they're doomed. They won't be able to think, and they'll be vulnerable to what the masses want. But the clever manipulator knows that it's a show. And behind that show and behind the scenes of that show, they've got another plan. And that's their ego plan. That's their egocentric plan. They pretend to be serving the masses, leading the masses, but actually they've got a plan with the masses to gain more power over the masses, to control the masses. So I found that book, The Undiscovered Self, very, very interesting. Jung is writing as though it were today in our political situation. We can see that happening before our very eyes. The project of individuation, of course, is to take another step and to become conscious, for the ego to become conscious of its motives, to become conscious of its egocentrism. Now, what are we appealing to? We're appealing to an ego to become conscious of itself. The shadow. The shadow is what is hidden from others, either out of shame or embarrassment or because it wouldn't play well in the public arena. And the ego also hides aspects of the shadow from itself. And those are the shameful aspects. Those are the types of experiences that the ego doesn't want to relive or look at, the traumas, the shameful moments. These are very difficult to digest. It's hard work. And so that step of individuation, becoming aware of the shadow and integrating the shadow, as we say, into one's self-concept, into how one sees oneself, is a very painful undertaking to really begin to recognize one's egocentrism is the basic step to recognize and to experience intensely one's own egocentrism. That's a big individuation step. But we go also beyond that. And this is where we come to this issue of the timeless that you mentioned at the outset, Jim. As we go more and more deeply into our psyches, we find in that pursuit, we find territories that are not subject to what we normally consider as the time-space parameters. And this is Jung called an inner world. This is a world or a psychic space that does not obey the laws of causality, which says first A, then B, then C in a temporal sequence. History, first there's a past, present, the future. It isn't like that in this area. In this non-temporal area, there are, first we could say images. That's the first thing one finds. What Jung calls archetypal images, these are big, important images like the gods, the demons, spiritual entities, all religions, religious traditions speak about these. It's an invisible world. And one discovers that as one explores the psyche. One goes into the psyche in a different way from the religious traditions. One goes in through observing dreams, doing what we call active imagination, working with the images that appear in visions or in dreams. And as one develops that area, one comes more and more into a space that is timeless. That is, it's a space like numbers. Numbers are not subject to time. Numbers by themselves. 2 + 2 is always 4. Eternally, time has no bearing on it. But when you combine numbers with time, you get a clock. And now it's 9 o'clock. Now it's 10 o'clock. So you're measuring. Then you're in the temporal world when you're measuring things. You're measuring the movement of objects, the relation of one object to another. And as long as you are in the world of material objects, no matter how tiny they are, you're in a temporal world. I read an article just the other day that an article has just been published in one of the scientific magazines that in the quantum world, there's what's called entanglement. And when two tiny particles are entangled with one another, it was thought that they change simultaneously. That if one particle is here in Switzerland, the other particle is in Japan or on the moon, doesn't matter where it is, and you change the spin slightly of one, it will change the spin of the other. The other one will change at exactly the same time. But they weren't measuring accurately enough, this article says, that there in 1/1,000,000,000 of a trillionth of a second, there is a difference between the one movement and the other movement. So because they're both in the material world, time plays a role. They are in the temporal world. Anything material is in the temporal world. But when you step out of the material world into the visionary world, into the world of symbols, you are not dealing with material objects. You're dealing with psychic objects. And some people get fascinated by these psychic objects, we call them symbols, and they stop with the symbol. And they worship the symbol. You know, you have icons and you have statues and you have beautiful paintings of symbolic representations of the god. And the temples are very impressive. And they were built to be impressive. And they were built to be timeless. When you step into a temple, Eliade called it a sacred space, you're stepping into a timeless world. You're stepping into a world of what we would say imagination, or into the spiritual world of gods and presences, invisible presences, who are somehow invested in coming into that space with you, and there you can experience them. If you look at the statue of Zeus long and carefully enough, and you ask him a question, he will nod his head if he agrees. He will shake his head if he doesn't agree. And you'll go away with a message. Or you go to the oracle at Delphi, you ask a question. The spiritual world is consulted and you get an answer. So staying within the material world and the world of symbols, you are still subject to temporality. What the symbol tries to do, or what the religious traditions try to do, is make the symbols stable and useful for people so that they can have some kind of contact with the invisible, timeless spiritual world. Some kind of contact. But then the religions start playing games with these symbols and manipulating the people, and you're right back into the power game and the egocentric game. Now the priests are in charge. Now you need the permission of the priest to get married or to get divorced or to bury the dead. You have to go to the priest. The priest has the final authority, and if you don't follow the priest's instructions, you will go to hell or purgatory, something like that. And so the church became very corrupt as a result of egocentricity. It wanted the power, and it wanted the power over the temporal rulers, the kings. So there were wars between the popes and the kings. But there's another way to take the symbol, and this is what Jung advocated, but I don't know if people, in great numbers at least, follow this, but this is the next step in the individuation, in the sense of becoming, intensifying the experience of the inner world. The symbol is a representation of something invisible. It isn't the thing itself, so it's not to be worshipped. It's like a staging area. This is what you take off from. This is what you, or this is a doorway. If you sit here for a while in this space with this symbol, but don't take it as the final word or the thing itself, the reality itself, you will be drawn into something else, into a timeless space, into a imageless space. It's imaging itself in the symbols, and it's giving you a doorway, a gateway to come to itself, but itself is the timeless center. And that's what Jung called the big self. And that big self has no boundaries. It's infinite. It isn't bound by space or time. And it is what in the Middle Ages was called the unus mundus. It's one world. It's a space where there are no distinctions because there are no objects. There are no images. It's all there, but it's not seen as discrete individual objects in space and time. Now, what we're trying to do, as I understand it, Jim, is to weave together in what we call a great individuation, weave together the big S self, as we're calling it, with the small s self and the ego s self. Okay, we're not abandoning the ego in favor of pulling up the ladder and climbing into the spaceship and staying in the timeless zone without reference to the body, without reference to life on the planet, without reference to ecology, power, money. Not at all, because those things remain as long as we're in the body. And we're in the body, and we're embodied souls, you could say, as long as we live. And we need to pay attention to the body and the body's needs and be conscious of them, but not to give them the centrality that egocentricity would give them. So this we call the modified self, or some people have called it the relativization of the self. Relativization of the ego, relativization of the ego in favor of the centrality of the self. And an image that has been used for that is the sun and the earth as a planet revolving around the sun. The ego is the earth that revolves around the sun. The earth is not as great, it is not self-sufficient, it is not as large, it is not as energized, it is not as powerful as the sun. The sun is the source of life on this planet. Plant life, animal life, human life. Without the sun, we wouldn't have the energy. We're dependent on the sun. And that realization that the ego is ultimately dependent on the self and should make all of its decisions, not from the egocentric point of view alone, but also in reference to the big picture of what is the planet Earth as it revolves around the sun, and what does the planet Earth need from the sun, and how can the planet Earth be conscious and remain conscious that it's dependent on the sun, and also to break the fallback position, to put a block on the fallback position, to retreating back into the gated walls of the ego and shutting out the rest of the world in favor of the ego self, to keep the doors open, to keep the eyes open. Now, this is a tremendous project, a tremendous undertaking. I think people have done similar things since time immemorial in many of the traditions. But in modern times, because it's a materialistic age that we're living in, this aspect of what we're calling the psychological self, the psychological world, the deep psychological world has been neglected, let's say. Not forgotten, but neglected. And we're trying to bring it back into focus, not through creating a new type of religion with all the problems that creates, a new collective and with a hierarchy and leaders and power positions and so on, but as teachers trying to encourage people to do their own individuation work, to intensify their experience of the total self, the total psyche as much as possible. And we believe that if they do that, egocentrism will at least be reduced, if not eliminated. That's our hope. That's our mission. And I think that's where I will conclude for today, Jim, and we'll take it further another time.
Wonderful, Murray. Very clearly stated. I wish there was a way that we could somehow, there was this big screen that we could project the points and the essence of what you're saying into kind of public view so people could hear it, connect the dots, open their eyes. A lot of what you said has great wisdom in it, and well done indeed in characterizing the project. I'm thinking not only would the public enjoy hearing it because it would turn the lights on, particularly around this political insanity, but I'm thinking too, children could hear this at a very young age. It could be part of education early on, aligned with their capacity, but nevertheless presented well, instead of so much of the drivel that is sent to children's minds in the service of adult egocentrism. Well done, Mark. Good work.
Okay. Thank you, Jim.